Beautiful community, it's lovely to be with you. And if I am, which I'm not really, your kind of civic and political wherewithal instructor, then you might have run into bad luck at the gym today, because instead of doing some nice exercises and going home, we're going to go for a bit of a marathon run. We're going to be here for an hour, and sometimes it's permissible for me to torture you, but not every day, so I'll try to get away with it today, see if I do. We're going to read in full an article by the public intellectual Michael Ignatieff about what on earth has happened with the collapse of political liberalism, left, right, and center, wherever we look in the West. It's not going to be a complex article, but it's going to be a challenging article. It might punch us in the face a little bit about our own failings. So if you want to stay for that, we'll probably be together for an hour. Brace yourselves, sit down, lie down, munch or not munch on something, and of course, may the force be with you. Now, the Canadian members of the beautiful community, which is about 5 to 10% of us, 5% of us at least, both here and on the main channel. Somehow on the main channel we always have a few more North Americans. I don't know why. But you would know Michael from his time in Canadian politics, which for him started around 2005 till 2011. And the rest of you, all you need to really understand is that Michael has had many hats on, but primarily today what he is a public thinker, a public intellectual. Many years ago I asked Michael what he thought the ethics of a public intellectual were. He managed to answer on behalf of his love and my love, Isaiah Berlin. But for himself, Michael doesn't actually love this tag that I use all the time, the tag of public intellectual, because I think Michael doesn't feel the need to be so self-conscious about what kind of hat you're wearing. He thinks that you can sort of give an account of how to be responsible and how to make a difference without these accounts of hat swapping. Whereas for me, the hat swapping is very central, right? Because for me, a philosopher and an intellectual puts truthfulness first, whereas a public intellectual doesn't. He puts the audience's, she puts the audience's relationship with truthfulness first. So it's not that we are sort of indifferent to truthfulness in this space and then reverential about it in the other. It's that this is weighed differently, right? So for me, your relationship with truthfulness matters more than truthfulness in our conversation. And I think you understand that. Let's go. And this is an article in the Washington Post. I was a liberal before I knew what the word meant. And Michael's born in 1947. Before I had read a word of John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, or John Rawls. Before, in fact, I knew anything about the world at all. Now, you might immediately say, well, hang on, there are lots of liberals who reject some or all of these thinkers vehemently. But the point isn't about that. I mean, take me, for example. I am in a way that you aren't familiar with because my philosophical work, due to illness, isn't yet so much out in the culture, but I'm a vehement anti-Rawlsian, as much as anybody could be almost. But if somebody talks to me about the work of John Rawls, especially somebody who knew Rawls and says, well, Jack Rawls said this and then he did that, and I feel almost a sacred admiration and reverence for Rawls, right? So if you like, and in many ways I'm not a liberal, but whatever that means, but in the ways that I am, it comes out not in agreement with Rawls, but in reverence for his enterprise. Okay, we'll try to make the footnotes less annoying. Liberalism was not a political idea. It was a family loyalty, born in the blood, and it became a way of life. We liberals commonly tell ourselves that unlike the far right and the far left, okay, I'll be annoying, the way the far left gets talked about in our culture is sometimes right, but is mostly bogus. That's to say, we do have the far right very often when we're referring to it, but we rarely have the far left when we're referring to it, for two reasons. Number one, we call far left a politics that's in no way far left. Let's say the degree of redistributive taxation that Bernie Sanders would favor, whatever you call it, it's not far left. Maybe Bernie's early career rhetoric could be called far left, but Bernie's politics today isn't. But we call it far left, and we call far right Orban. That creates an absolutely bizarre equivalence. But then the second thing that's wrong with our far left label is that the internet anti-woke brigade, largely algorithmically and psychologically lost, like Jordan Peterson, call liberal hyperidentity politics, which I recognize as a very important democratic catastrophe and disease, far left. But it's not. It's actually liberalism gone wrong. So we have a kind of and the real left, right, recognizes that. It recognizes that hyperidentity politics is not left. It sees it, in fact, as a kind of a corporate cover for not doing anything about the structural disadvantages imposed upon the various groups hyperidentity politics claims to defend, right? But in fact, the whole story functions as a way of, and this is not my language because I'm not a leftist, but a leftist could coherently say this from their point of view, that this whole hyperidentity politics discourse is a way for covering for the ruling class. Okay, I failed to behave better with footnotes, so let's try again. Now, unlike the far left and the far right, we reach our beliefs through a rational inspection of the world as it is, we tell ourselves, Michael writes. But I didn't get my ideas that way. I didn't form my convictions through a critical evaluation of evidence about life as it actually was. I was born a liberal. My parents were liberals. Their friends were liberals. And my father worked for 30 years for liberal governments in Canada. Some of my earliest memories are political. At the age of 5 in 1952, watching the Republican National Convention with my parents on the fuzzy first black and white television we ever owned. My parents were Canadian diplomats in Washington, and they were for Democrat Adlai Stevenson, not Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. And like their American friends, they were horrified by Joseph McCarthy, the scowling Republican bully who presided over the Senate Army hearings. So before I knew anything at all, pretty much as soon as I could stand up and put on my clothes, the label had been sewn into the shirt on my back. We liberals of the 60s, I became one of them, thought that we had laid the granite of basic security under everyone's feet. 60 years later, the granite is cracking. The liberal state is frayed, contested, underfunded, straining at the seams, and we're defending our achievements, and none too successfully, against populists and authoritarians who want to take it apart, take our achievement apart. They've mobilized resentment at the price of social solidarity, but they offer no solutions, or solutions so drastic, such as the forcible deportation of millions of migrants, that they would tear society to pieces. A politics that stokes anger without proposing solutions is not a politics. It's an okay public intellectual thing to say. Even though I personally don't say it, because I always want to emphasize how much destructive values can motivate a politics, and even indeed motivate it nearly exhaustively in some cases. So we can have just purely non-constructive politics, but Michael's absolutely fine to say that. It is only manipulation. He's talking about clearly Trump here, among others. And we like to think that we are in the solution business. We're right about that, but we keep on defending achievements of long ago instead of raising our sights and finding a way to fund and reinvent social solidarity for the 21st century. They might say, who the hell is we? And we is we liberals. And I am much less of a liberal with liberal on my shirt than Michael is. And my use of the term is particularly loose, right? It's roughly somebody who is committed to. I often use it as a shorthand for just being committed to democratic institutions and not smashing them. But I think more richly, the way you think about what Michael is saying, from his point of view, is that a liberal isn't somebody who necessarily prefers one political candidate over another, but as somebody who is defined by the way they prefer them, right? So in Michael's liberal camp, you could have people who've voted for Bernie Sanders and people who voted for Mitt Romney. But what will distinguish them, including distinguishing them from other citizens who voted for Sanders and Bernie, is the way they voted. For instance, the self-consciousness with which they've thought about other citizens who disagree with them, the self-consciousness of their commitment to pluralism in society and having a multiplicity of contesting voices and so on. Enough. For my heyday, 1945 to 1975, the glorious 30 years of robust growth and relative equality has gone forever. Beginning with the oil crisis of the 1970s, an abyss slowly opened up between a credentialed elite and an uncredentialed working class whose steady union jobs were stripped out and shipped overseas. So notice straight away, right, how much Michael is talking about class without naming it, and how little recent Western social justice discourse has been engaged with class and structural disadvantage thought of in a serious, realistic way to do with what people feel upset about on the doorstep, rather than the evasion of intersectional discourse with its twang of postmodernism descended from privileged literature departments. Those of us who got the credentials to enter the professional classes did well, but plenty of our fellow citizens fell behind. We didn't notice this in time, and our failure opened up a chasm between who we were, what we believed, and the people we represented. We kept offering equality of opportunity, a chance for the credentialed few to enter the professional elite, without tackling capitalism's remorseless distribution of economic disadvantage itself. So we're just into the second page of 6, just to give you a sense of how long we're going to be together. And one of the remarks to make here historically is that one of the legacies of what I call neoliberalism, which is not what leftists call neoliberalism. Leftists tend to want to define neoliberalism as an actual position. I don't recognize neoliberalism as an actual position. I see neoliberalism as a thoughtless giving of primacy to the market. If the primacy you give to the market is thoughtful, no matter how robust and strong it is, you're not a neoliberal in my books. You're just making a strong case for the market that you could be right or wrong. But it's this magical thinking about the primacy of the market that indeed has defined much of late 20th century Western politics. And that's been a great disease from which we are not recovering, and the consequences of which are partly expressed in victories of post-truth populist authoritarians left, right, and center. But what we're going to see, funnily enough, is these populist right authoritarians going left on the economy at least at the level of discourse, if not at the level of delivering. So a lot of the populist right post-truth authoritarians of the 2030s are going to be emphasizing left economic populism as part of their project. They'll often do nothing about it in practice, but they'll keep engaging with it. So this is going to be a way in which, at least at the level of discourse, the right, or if you like, the ex-right, right, the ex-conservatives who've become post-truth, post-democratic politicians, are going to move left on the economy. Meanwhile, centrist and center-left politics in the 2030s will move right on culture. That's the tendency that I am anticipating. By the late 1990s, the conservatives began to gain power by playing to the resentments of the ignored. The authoritarian right especially understood that it could build an entire politics on mocking the blindness of the liberal elite. It didn't need solutions. Stoking rage was enough. And now, of course, right, how much we're stuck with this as a challenge magnified by algorithms. We're now the embattled object of that rage. What will it take to earn the trust of those whose discontent we ignored, right? Because in part, populism, as most people define it, not as I define it, I define populism primarily as a matter of texture of discourse. So populism for me is an issue about how far public discourse is bridging toward private sentiment and equating itself with kitchen table talk. And the opposite of that is when the two are at a great distance, when the Western liberal state justifies things to itself in very general bureaucratic terms that are at a distance from kitchen table talk. So the more politicians move toward kitchen table talk, the more populism we have. So you see how that's not entirely, but pretty neutral around the question of whether populism is a constructive or destructive thing. Right? Because all I'm talking about is discourse. Now, the reason I say not entirely is because if you just do politics in kitchen table talk, you in the end undermine your capacity to justify yourself in the more general terms, which if you entirely lose out of sight, you're going to pretty much lose trust in counter-majoritarian institutions. But for me, the central way we talk about populism, we should talk about populism, is a matter of discourse. It's a matter of one of the core political questions, which is the relation of private sentiment and public discourse. And the pattern of contemporary, Western politics is that there is a drift of public discourse toward private sentiment. Historically, there have been other versions of drifts in this space. So, for instance, in the communist bloc, what you had was a drift of private discourse toward private sentiment and private discourse toward public discourse, right? The state wanted to eat up private discourse so that at the kitchen table, people would talk in clunky bureaucratic terms. So what you want in a healthy society is, as my great hero Bernard Williams used to say, for private sentiment and public discourse not to be too close to each other, but not to be too far from each other either. But the way most people talk about populism isn't to do with discourse, so I'll give credit to that way of talking about it too for a moment by pointing out that what people often label populism, who talk about it well, is the is not just resentment, right, at a politics which ignored the discontent of much of the citizenry, but resentment at that politics via the re-legislation of issues which that politics that ignored the discontent pretended had already been settled. Right. So a lot of what John Gray, for example, the UK public intellectual, calls populism is the re-legislation of issues that centrist politics thought that it had tackled. So, for instance, centrist politics had assumed, right, that we need a relatively human rights friendly immigration policy. And now civic consent in Western societies is saying, no way, Jose, we don't want that. And the question Michael is asking here, what will it take to earn the trust of those whose discontent we ignored, is one that's worth repeating 10 times over. So think about it. Take a Joe Biden, who's about to leave office in a couple of days. Imagine you've stripped Joe Biden of his cognitive decline, which he, began to suffer from at least as early as 2019. And he's a healthy and robust politician. He's running for a second term. Let's say he's won. What does Joe need to not just do, but say, and say about what he does to American citizens, right? To address that discontent seriously, to earn the trust of those whose discontent folks like Joe ignored. What does he need to do? What does he need to say? What does he need to say about what he does? And how radical does it need to be? And that could be a question for Michael. Michael, have you yourself understood the seriousness of the question you've asked? Have you yourself understood that what Joe may need to do and say may be more radical than you would like to imagine, right? Because one of the things that, despite Joe's cognitive decline, that Michael and I share in our evaluation of Biden is that Biden has actually been a practically efficacious president relative to some predecessors, even indeed relative to Obama. That's not an approval of his policies. It's just to say that he's actually been practically efficacious, even though on the surface he has looked like a catastrophe, beset by cognitive decline, and that way undermining trust in U.S. institutions. Let's go on. Liberalism in the next generation will need to save social solidarity from the creative destruction of the market by rebuilding a fiscal capacity of the liberal state and investing in public goods that underpin a common life for all. Nicely said, right? But how do you justify that sort of policy to citizens who've lost trust in the institutions that you need to deliver such a policy? But it's the right thing to say. And I agree. That this has got to be a return to the language of interests, collective interests of the citizenry, right? What are the interests of all Americans? So it's a discourse about interests of everybody, tied to solidarity and then fueled by patriotism. But it's a very uphill challenge, because what you've got to understand is something that I've got in trouble with a 0.4% of the audience here on the main channel, is that Trump's campaign was a calamity. And Trump, minus a few elements of communicative genius, right, that he has, is a disaster of a candidate. Not disaster because he's bad for America, but disaster because he's incompetent on his own terms. And yet he won. So, and what I got in trouble with was for a sort of mixed message that I kept saying for 2 years that Trump was likely to win, including after Kamala Harris took over. I said that for the first time the Dems had a chance of victory, but that Trump was still very likely to win, whereas with Biden staying up, I thought it was nearly impossible. Not nearly impossible, but a real stretch. But I kept saying that the Trump campaign was flailing and that he was likely to win. And people didn't like that mixed message because we don't like keeping two things in mind at the same time. But that's very important to remember, because we lost, you lost, beautiful American citizens who wanted Trump to lose to a buffoon. That's to say that if Trump had the competence of a Putin, he would have obliterated Kamala Harris on a totally different order of electoral victory. So if we are losing to that, we are doing something very wrong. Saying this, as Michael says, at a high level of generality is easy enough. Well, of course. The tougher part will be finding the language and the cunning to convert a radical liberalism into a politics that wins elections. And here, the way Michael's put it is very important. How do you return liberatory credentials, right, to a discredited quasi-neoliberal post-Cold War liberalism? Samuel Moyn is one of the people recently who's been thinking about this, writing about this. Very important questions. How do you return the liberatory credentials of liberalism to it? So you want a politics that wins elections and a governing strategy that pushes change through the veto-rich thicket of interests waiting to derail our best-laid plans. In the meantime, we lament the identity politics of our populist and authoritarian competitors, when it would be more honest to admit that identity is where all political beliefs actually come from, including our own. My identity, charter member of the white professional classes of Canada, defined my liberalism, while the liberal critique of identity politics, what the liberal critique of identity politics does get right, though, we owe to our much maligned individualism. Identity is not destiny. Sorry for my Australian accent. Identity. Every formative confrontation with in fact, beautiful to have an Australian accent. Very, always enjoy the bit of my Australian identity coming out. What the liberal critique of identity gets right is it's about individualism. Identity is not destiny. We can either make up our own minds or borrow somebody else's beliefs. The convictions that stick are the ones that we decide for ourselves. The beliefs that we hold on to are the ones that first required a primal yay or nay to the allegiances we started life with. In the 1960s, I could have rebelled against my parents' liberalism. Many of my generation did. Instead, I said yes to the world I was born into and the parents I was lucky enough to have. The Canada I grew up in had been white and aggressively heterosexual. By 1980, I was living in a multiracial and sexually pluralistic society, teeming with new citizens from every corner of the globe. The contrast is captured in the comparison of my University of Toronto graduation class photo from 1969, mostly male, at least professedly straight, all white, and the graduation photo of the same age group at the same college in 2024, majority female, every color of the rainbow, turbans, hijabs, skull caps, all expressive of a new diversity that we liberals quickly turned into a religion of our own. Now, for those of you who already heard me speak about hyper-identity politics, right? Heard me say that it entails several moves, right? And I think Michael can be with us for all of them. You move from seeing political disagreement as political disagreement to seeing it as core moral disagreement. First move. Second move, you see core moral disagreement as essentially about identity, right? If I'm attacking your politics, I'm attacking something morally core about you in these terms, and I'm attacking who you are. In an alternate conception of this, let's say something borrowed from the ancient Greeks, when I'm critiquing your moral stance, even if we allow wrongly, right, that political difference is core moral difference, I'm critiquing your character with the potential to give you insight to improve your character, or with the potential for you to say, no, your critique is wrong and it's you, Vlad, who has to improve your character, right? But we're not fighting about our identity here. So you move from seeing political disagreement as political disagreement to seeing it as a sort of core moral disagreement. Then you see core moral disagreement is about identity. Both of these two moves are significant mistakes, but they're toxically present in our culture. And then you move from that to insisting that the institutions come in on the game and that they privilege the identity of your side of the argument and privilege it as identity, and then try to inculcate it as an identity in future generations. So you say BLM is not just my political argument. BLM is a moral stance, and it's about identity, and all institutions should say, we are BLM, everybody who is a member of us should be BLM, and everybody who is a future member of us should be BLM too, which creates the, quite frankly, democratically farcical scenario of somebody like me, for instance, who comes in and says, well, I am not a conservative. I am in love with reflecting on disadvantage and structural disadvantage. So I believe there is racism. I believe there is structural racism out there in the United States. But that doesn't follow that I believe that cumulatively the weight of pros and cons of the public politics of BLM works in BLM's favor. In fact, I think that on balance, as far as the public impact of BLM, the impact has been positive and negative, and more negative than positive, right? And one of the negative implications is the increase of chances of the center and the left remaining and becoming so depoliticized they don't have the skills to take on Trump, right? BLM was a depoliticizing movement, fundamentally, and therefore increased the chances of those sympathetic to it becoming progressively more incompetent and beating disgraceful right populists. Now, I actually think there was something private about BLM to do with private discourse that was more positive than negative. I think BLM helped a segment of the population deal with racist tendencies they had and raise more questions about them. So I actually think BLM's most positive effect was non-political. It allowed Ricky to say, I kind of think my beliefs are in order, but maybe somehow at the level of images, I'm seeing, others in my society who are not white as somehow, in a way that doesn't give them full testimonial credibility, full epistemic credibility. I'm somehow aesthetically a bit put off, and maybe that allows me to sort of partake wrongly in some deprioritization of them. So BLM did a lot of good that way, but politically it was negative. Now, the position I expressed is not just very moderate. It's nearly irresistible if you're seriously analyzing politics, right? But hyper-identity politics would want to exclude my position, not just excluded by arguing against it, but institutionally excluded, right? Which is obviously toxic, but it's more toxic on the protagonists of that position than on me, even though it's toxic on me too, because if you're a protagonist of such a position, you are the greatest political loser to right-wing populists, right? Your profession becomes losing to post-truth populists because you are so depoliticized, so disengaged from actual agency, right, of who needs to do what and how and say what and how to defeat these folks. And you're just debarred from engaging in serious appeals to patriotism and solidarity. Okay. That's a little bit of me on wokeism. Now let's see where Michael takes it. The still unfolding multidimensional revolution turned out to be the cardinal liberal achievement of my era, but it enormously complicated the liberal task of finding the middle way between the Scylla and Charybdis of extremisms. We were naive about the nature of this problem, preferring to believe that all reasonable human beings would embrace a revolution of inclusion, when the reality was that our revolution had upended the entire social order and even our place in it. Diversity of gender, of sexual orientation, race, religion, class was a virtue in comparison to the dire cantonment of people in silos of exclusion. But liberals turned diversity into an ideology. Once an ideology, it quickly became a coercive program of invigilating speech and behavior in the name of dignity and respect. Now, it's very important to make two things clearly separate here. The 1960s revolution of inclusion has nothing to do with hyperidentity politics. Moreover, saying that it didn't go anywhere near far enough, because we still need to further free from disadvantage many disadvantaged groups in societies, also has nothing to do with hyperidentity politics. So distinguish making constructive progress on inclusion and that creating backlash in society, which is what Michael's talking about here, right in this paragraph. Distinguish that from unconstructive projects, fake projects for inclusion, creating backlash. So don't confuse the two, right? Legitimate enterprises of challenging the ways in which black folks in the United States are still deprioritized, create backlash. That's one thing. But then BS, depoliticized identity politics, hyper-identity politics-driven projects of doing the same also create backlash. Don't confuse the two. That's what the right, and especially the populist right, does, right? Giving up on hyper-ID does not mean giving up on fighting for social justice and inclusion. It just means giving up on toxic ways of fighting for that. And one of the problems that we've seen from hyper-identity politics in recent times in our culture is this extraordinary idea that you can win a political argument by pretending you've won it when you haven't, right? So imagine that we have 10 people in this room and that 2 people make a case for something, 8 people remain unpersuaded. And let's say it's the case for the color blue. And let's say that the 8 who remain unpersuaded remain stuck with the idea that green's better than blue. And then having failed to persuade the other 8, the 2 just put up the blue flag. And the other 8 greens have to sit there and say, well, we didn't support that, but it's put up in our name. And the idea is that if you put up a flag like that, it'll eventually convince the 8 greens to come on board. Well, it doesn't, right? So one of the worst ways of trying to win political arguments, even just at the level of efficacy, is by pretending that you've won them already. By pretending that you need to stop contesting and making the case, and that you can just declare that you've won them, ask public institutions to act as though the country now agrees on them, when most of the country doesn't. Enough. Credentialed white people of my generation welcomed the revolution, Michael goes on, because we could invite recruits of color into our ranks without ever feeling that our own elite status was being challenged. We didn't seem to notice that non-elite white people were threatened, even betrayed by the new multiracial order. Faced with what, and again, keep in mind these two things, right? Tackling challenges of inclusion constructively, tackling challenges of inclusion destructively, and both potentially creating backlash. But don't confuse the two, and don't confuse the backlash to the one with the backlash to the other. Faced with what we thought was white racism and sexism, when it was mostly fear, we began promulgating codes of speech and conduct to impose diversity as a new cultural norm. And so what Michael is saying is that what happened eventually is that in response to backlash to constructive inclusion, we engaged in a project of toxic inclusion, fake inclusion. And that too generated backlash. And in response to that, we did even more toxic and unconstructive inclusion. instead of doing constructive inclusion. New bureaucracies in universities, corporate headquarters and government offices enforced a diversity at the price of freedom. The freedom to defend unpopular loyalties, to freely dislike others, to be funny at other people's expense, to be critical of the pieties of others but especially our own. A liberalism whose defining value should have been liberty invented a diversity and inclusion industry whose guiding principle may have been justice, but whose means of enforcement were coercion, public disgrace, and exclusion. And so the word industry is very important, because one of the main explanations causally for hyperidentity politics is the sociological explanation that it helps the sort of micro power advancement of a certain professional class. Right? So taking particular hyperidentity politics positions on particular group rights is about gaining professional advantage for an elite contesting among itself. What you've got to do very clearly, though, is stop short of that power analysis. You've got to stop short of it going to the alt-right Jordan Peterson side, where you see the entirety of hyperidentity politics as a sort of a battle of power relations. You can dress up in various sort of sub-Marxist terms. Because what you'll then miss is that this is a liberal phenomena rather than a leftist phenomena. And Peterson, in his impoverished analysis, partly because he's making a mistake, but partly because he doesn't have the psychological strength to not be triggered by the issue to analyze it properly, which is ironic, given that psychological strength is a central part of Jordan's brand. Jordan is often too psychologically weak to be untriggered by issues he is analyzing, making his mistakes not just mistakes, but incapacities to have the psychic wherewithal to address an issue. But what you can't say is that this is a leftist story. And the reason you can't say it's a leftist story is because of the power of self-ratification in the way identity belonging works, even for the most extreme hyper-identity politics practitioners who say something about themselves intersectionally. I am an A plus B plus C kind of person in terms of gender, race, history, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of self-ratification, which says it's not just that you're born into these identities, is that I see them and I ratify myself as belonging to them. That is a fundamental expression of the politics of authenticity that derives from the Romantic movement, right? Tied to a second item, which is just the old liberal politics of exclusion. So it's the liberal politics of exclusion on steroids, plus the sort of narcissistic deformation of the central value, which is a benign value in our culture, the value of authenticity, that creates this. This is, God damn it, a liberal story. It's a story about political inclusion and individual self-realization. This is not a left story. And this is so humiliating, because if you look at the entirety of the anti-woke brigade online, right, they go on about a leftism that isn't there in the phenomena that you're attacking. Michael is not a leftist. And what's gone wrong is, in a way, Michael's own political tradition and my own political tradition disgracing itself in this way, rather than leftism coming in and ruining our politics. The real left's position on hyperidentity politics is that this is just a sort of repulsive corporate veneer for not taking exclusion seriously. Let's go on. Well, no, one more remark. Michael is implying that institutions have been screwed over by this. And is this an exaggeration or is it true? It's true, right? Academic institutions have been screwed over by this. Speech has been policed at universities at the level of bureaucracy, not just at the level of individual academics and students policing each other. Students have got into the habit of wanting to deplatform or cancel voices they think which are morally wrong and challenge their identity. Outside the academy, the media has to some degree sunk into this problem too. Many social movements, like the climate movement, has sunk into this problem too, right? In many branches of the climate movement for years, and I've got an article soon coming out about this off YouTube, I hope, has taken the position that if you want to do climate, you've got to do climate justice. If you want to do climate justice, you've got to do racial justice. If you want to do racial justice, you've got to do trans justice. And not just any racial justice and trans justice you want, racial and trans justice along the lines of the latest incarnation of hyperidentity discourse in these areas, right? So it's not enough to say I love trans people and like Jordan Peterson, I believe in their rights. That's not good enough. What you have to say is that the ephemeral commitment of trans discourse, which will harm and has already harmed trans people, to the idea that there can never be a conflict between the rights of trans people and the rights of anybody else, is something you have to assent to. If you don't assent to it, you can't join the climate movement. That's to say, you've got to say that all ideas of conflicts of rights between trans women and biological women are ephemeral. That's to say, once you properly understand the rights of biological women, the rights of trans women, you'd see that they could never conflict. Well, that's a position so absurd, so devoid of politics, that nobody who isn't in a pathological relation to this question is actually going to take it seriously. But nevertheless, in much of our culture, we do. But the point is, that's not going to help trans people, already hasn't. Because what trans people need is advocacy for their political rights, not claims that they don't need advocacy for their political rights because their rights don't clash with anybody else's. Now, all of that sort of stuff you need to tick before you join the movement, right? So it's happened across media, it happened across academic institutions, it happened across social movements, more or less, depending on the sphere, depending on the country, but it happened. So what Michael is describing is real. Now, somebody like John Gray, the UK public intellectual, thinks that that's it, that academic institutions are screwed now. I don't. Because if you look at a country like the UK, you're clearly seeing the recession of hyperidentity politics in the education system, even though bureaucracies are still committed to it. And that's because while the majority of, let's say, humanities and social science academics in the UK, sorts of people I know, are left, they're Bernie Sanders voters, really. 60 to 80% of them still don't buy the woke story. They just believe in the rights of the groups wokeism represents, but don't believe the woke story. So they've been self-censoring, and they're slowly now among themselves debating about how to come out. Right? So that's the context. So Michael's not dreaming here. If anything, he's being very modest in how he's putting this. And he only started talking about this a few years ago. Let's go. Worst of all, we censored ourselves, willingly turning off our bullshit detectors and stilling the inner doubts that might have made us confront our mistakes. And notice how extraordinarily rare what I've just said a few moments ago is on the internet. We'll talk about that more at the end. A situation where you're rejecting hyper ID, but you're still, goddammit, defending the disadvantage and the rights of all the groups that it tried to defend, right? Because at the moment you either have the hyper ID position or the toxic alt-right anti-woke brigade rejection of it. And we're in a very narrow middle ground, which will widen in the next few years, of course, in the West. But we're in a very narrow middle ground, the kind that algorithms hate, quite frankly, because they want you to go into the one or the other side of this sort of fissure, which is to say, you go Jordan Peterson or you go Hyper ID, right? And Michael is absolutely rejecting both, and I am, and that's bloody unusual on the internet today. But that's what true responsibility to you is all about when it comes to public intellectuals operating. We abandoned the truism that arguments are true or false, irrespective of the race and origins of the person who makes them. We began promoting arguments as true based on gender, race, and class, origins or backstory, oppression, discrimination, history, family violence of the person uttering them. The value that we placed on diversity and inclusion led us by stages to jettison a care for truth itself. We ended up compromising the very epistemological privilege that had provided us with such unending self-satisfaction. And so this is important, because when beautiful Tim Snyder is out there perfectly capturing the post-truth dynamics of Trump's discourse, we've also got to say, hey, this kind of toxic liberalism in reverse also contributed to post-truth dynamics. You've got to be honest and say some of the post-truth catastrophe is not only caused by the ex-conservative, ex-right populism, it's also caused by us. I'll give you just one example, because I have done a little bit on a very infinitesimal scale of sort of disability advocacy online, and I used to do, and I'm still doing, there's a YouTube channel for this, a little diary called Vlad's Myalgic Encephalomyelitis Diary, where I just talked about disability issues. And I'd often get correspondence from American citizens saying, Vlad, you get this wrong, because you're casting being chronically ill and unable to work as a problem, but it's only a problem in a certain kind of capitalist order that is ableist. In a properly ableism-free society, would be neutral between citizens who can work and citizens who can't work, which creates a small problem that humans, God damn it, want to do what they want to do. But this argument and the idea that that's just so because we live in some ableist society is absolutely post-truth and postmodernist insanity. As the argument was made also to me, and it really was made, that having two legs is not better than having one, because it's in this sort of normatively repressive capitalism that's very ableist, in which we say that two legs is better. But imagine a society where everybody had one leg, then one leg would be normal. And actually, it was people with significant disabilities were writing this, and this weren't people with mild asthma writing it in. These were actually some wheelchair-bound people writing this in, and still saying that their being wheelchair-bound is actually a version of normal, and it only isn't seen as such because of the capitalist ableism of our society. And I'm sorry, but if you are wheelchair-bound, that's not a version of normal. That's a delimitation, and a tragic delimitation. Might not be too tragic if you're in a wheelchair, but you're high functioning and not suffering that much. But, you know, being in a lot of pain is not a version of normal. And being restricted in what you dream of doing is not a version of normal that we've been brainwashed into. You know, you can't say we've been brainwashed into seeing that as abnormal by some kind of disgraceful ableism. So see how toxic hyper-identity politics is? It is still trying to a degree to normalize disability in a toxic way that didn't even let disabled people say, I am suffering, I'm being ignored because I'm not getting the research investment that I need to help me, you know, cure my illness. and I'm suffering and I'm delimited, I'm being ignored. It didn't let folks make that argument because it argued toxically that being disabled was an identity that was a version of normal. Right? That's going to seem insane 20 years from now. Okay, the old liberal epistemology at least rested on egalitarian and universal premises. We believe that everyone was capable of entering to some degree into the mental world and lived experience of others, because all of us, regardless of race, creed, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, were rational human creatures. Now, it is bloody tough to understand the experience of another, but we are not in isolated epistemic bubbles. One of the most remarkable experiences that I have had a few times in my life, as a result of my history of illness and history of not being able to walk, talk, or speak for a few years of my life, is that when I meet people who have been through extremes of political calamity, not health constitution calamity, we get each other. Somebody who's been in solitary confinement in a repressive regime, when we meet for the first time, they immediately get me. And I immediately get them, even though I've never been through what they've been through, and they haven't been through what I've been through. Somebody who hasn't been through either would struggle to get us, because it's about sort of looking under the carpet of existence and experiencing big stuff happening to you, right? But big stuff is big stuff is big stuff, and people who've gone through big stuff can understand each other. So we're not in these epistemic bubbles that hyper-ID likes to say we are in. The rationalist universalism disintegrated in the 80s and 90s, attacked by a new progressive generation of progressive scholars as masculinist, colonialist, racist, and fundamentally condescending. Now, Michael is not saying that colonialism isn't, in many respects, an evil. And Michael is not saying that decolonization isn't a worthwhile enterprise. But he's saying that some decolonization discourse has clearly gone wrong. This assault was supposed to awaken us to intersectionality, the intersection of disadvantages. But instead of drawing herd constituencies together, it fragmented them into highly sectarian and identity-based political groupings that foreclosed on alliances, shared understandings, and common political projects across race, class, and gender. So now, liberals denounce the prison house of identity politics without realizing the degree to which the new self-defeating politics is a consequence of the very revolution we helped to foment. Now, one of the interesting questions is that the critiques of liberalism in the West that we get, and the outside critiques of it from somebody like Dugan, say, hey guys, nice Michael and Vlad dancing around here saying that the inclusion is great in the 60s and it should have gone further, but the hyper-ID version of it is bad. Well, Michael and Vlad are wrong, because hyper-identity politics was an inevitable consequence of the original 1960s wave of inclusion. And the hyper-identity politics today is going to have another inevitable consequence, which is the collapse of all solidarity and all capacity to tether democratic societies together, and the collapse of democracy. So it's what happened in the 60s that's made the collapse of democracy inevitable. And we have to say, screw you, Dugan, it wasn't inevitable, and we can renew our political discourse and at least have a go at coming out of the cul-de-sac we got ourselves into. We reject your linear, overdetermined Fukuyamianism in reverse story about our collapse. So get out of here. But we got to be able to say that robustly. That, you know, the good story of inclusion doesn't inevitably lead to the bad story of inclusion. And the bad story of inclusion doesn't inevitably lead to collapse. Needless to say, at the time I understood little or nothing of this. But these were some of the factors. The complacent politics of virtue, the blindness to the new inequality, the conceit that ours was the only rational politics that began to erode the electoral base that had sustained the center of Western liberal politics. The convictions of my youth had survived from 1968, sheltering me from any mind-changing encounter with the world that had metamorphosed around me and the end of the Cold War. When in 2005 I left behind a professorship at Harvard and took the plunge into Liberal Party politics in Canada, it didn't feel like a crazy departure from security, tenure and privilege, but instead as if my feet had been traveling homeward all along. So let's make an announcement about how close to the end we are. We're close. We're in the last 20% here of our chat. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. I had no understanding of my own inexperience and no grasp of how weakened and debilitated the liberalism of my party had become. We were a party that kept winning elections and governing the country, but with a vote share slowly declining in the small towns and rural districts and piling up in the downtown urban centers where the professional and commercial elites like to live. When I led the party into an election in 2011, truth be told, the Liberal platform had not much to offer a people still shocked by the financial crash from 3 years earlier. Our message, though we never said so directly, was trust us, we're the adults in the room. We even called ourselves the natural party of government. On election night, our party suffered the worst defeat in our history, and I lost my seat in Parliament, a verdict that all these years later reads to me like a judgment, not only on me, but also on a liberalism that had allowed itself to be captured by its own self-regard. And of course, Fire and Ashes is Michael's beautiful book about that political experience, which I recommend. But let me just make one quick side point, non-politically here. It's quite interesting. And that's that Michael Ignatieff is charismatic. He's now well into his 70s, but when he walks into a room right now, he's charismatic. If you didn't know who he was, you'd say, oh, who is this man with striking aristocratic self-possession? But charisma, interestingly, doesn't always translate into politics, into charisma in politics. And Michael had a charisma that I felt never fully translated into the political. I mean, two of the most charismatic humans I've ever met are the great pianist Alfred Brendel and the filmmaker Werner Herzog. Very charismatic men, profoundly confident men. But translate that charisma into politics, it won't necessarily work. Some of my philosophical heroes, right, were very charismatic, like the philosopher Bernard Williams. But you put Bernard in a room with somebody shouting from the back of the room at Bernard, you're a traitor, get off the stage. Bernard would not necessarily be like a fish in water handling that organically. And Michael had more political charisma than somebody like Bernard, but still not enough. So one version of political charisma is to be able to have somebody shout from the back row that you're a traitor and a disgrace, and to ask them, what jacket are you wearing today? How does it feel on you? What are your emotions today? You've just had a go with me, so keep yourself standing for 2 minutes, and I want to see how you feel behind the words you said to me. By the way, nice to meet you. That's a political, and I have very low political charisma, but I've just given you an example of the way that charisma doesn't translate from one field to another. Okay, enough of a footnote. Defeat is a great teacher. It taught me that liberalism endures because it's a way of being and a set of values that tells us who we should try to be. This is what gives liberalism its hidden resilience, its capacity to rebuild after political reversals. If we want to rebuild, we'll want to recover what the word used to mean. It was once a synonym for generosity. In the old days, a liberal gentleman was a generous man. We'll want to discard these male elitist associations by marrying generosity to the egalitarian individualism at the core of the liberal creed. The core of the liberal creed is the idea of equal rights, for instance, and the idea that folks should not suffer the terrible consequences of sheer bad luck that has beset them in society. Right? That society and the state should come in and hold them up. What liberals value should be within everyone's reach. A liberal person wants to be generous, open, alive to new possibility, willing to learn from anyone. Notice how Michael is not trying to cast this in terms of particular policy positions. We want to share whatever wealth and fortune we have, to welcome strangers to our table, to stand up for people when they're in trouble. We know we have to change our minds when someone's ideas better than ours. We have faith that history rewards those willing to fight for what they believe. Now, none of us is ever as generous as we'd like to be, and no liberal has a monopoly on generosity, but the largeness of spirit it calls us to does define our horizon of hope. Now, this is beginning to border on kitsch. It just about stays on the right side of that border, simply because Michael's trying to capture the concerns rather than the beliefs and policy commitments of the kind of liberal that he is. Such values are in battle today, and they need defending because our societies are so desperately in need of largeness of spirit, together with a revived liberal idea of solidarity. And this is something else that Michael's introducing here, that you've got to be bold. And this is something that I passionately agree with him on, that in the face of post-truth right populism, the way you come out of the cul-de-sacs that centrist and centre-left politics has got itself into isn't by sort of, retreating into a corner and making defensive moves. It's actually by being bold and playing offense. Go back to what we said Joe Biden would need to do and say, Joe Biden without cognitive decline would need to do and say to citizenry. And we are in a frightful pattern of retreat, right? In my country, we've got a centrist Labour government that is terrified and is in retreat and can't be imaginative and bold. We've got an institution like the BBC that is in large degree scared and is making defensive moves that only further helps increase its chances of not existing 10 years from now, right? What you've got to do is boldness, not the depoliticized, divisive boldness of hyper-identity politics, but constructive boldness based on appeals to patriotism, appeals to solidarity, and a confidence in calling out all the BS of ex-right, ex-conservative, post-truth populism. Defeat has taught me that we can't afford to jettison our values when the tides of politics turn against us. Liberalism's incorrigible vitality comes from the fact that it tells us who we most deeply want to be, providing that we are willing to fight for it and never surrender to the passing fashions of despair. So let's finalize ourselves by making two remarks. I have just criticized mainstream media for playing defense and being conservative. Not in the political sense, but in the level of just sitting in the corner and trying to just survive this onslaught of sort of algorithmic battering that it's receiving. And the alternative many people have turned to is independent media online. And what I've got to make clear is that independent media overwhelmingly, not exhaustively, but to a large extent, is sinking in grotesque irresponsibility and algorithm capture. And so we've got a crisis of both. And we've got to have separate conversations about boldness and responsibility in both. And one of the remarkable things about the hour and the 10 minutes we've just shared together is that we have engaged in a constructive critique of the collapse of resistance liberalism, if you like, and the collapse of hyper-identity politics without losing touch with healthily progressive politics and without yielding anything to the BS of the post-truth alt-right populists who monopolize this space of criticizing some of the cul-de-sacs that hyper-identity politics, center-left politics, centrist bureaucratic managerialism has got us into. Lots of love and thank you.